Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies, I extend a warm welcome to each of you as we gather for this significant event in our Global African Lecture Series. We are honored to host you here today at the African University of Communications and Business, and to connect with those joining us virtually from around the world. Today, we are privileged to dive into an immensely important topic: Africa's place in the 21st century. China will not save Africa. As we navigate through complex global dynamics in which Africa plays a crucial role, it is vital to engage in such discussions that challenge prevailing narratives and encourage critical thought. Our wonderful speaker, with his extensive background in sociology and interdisciplinary studies at Grand Valley State University, brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise that promises to enrich our understanding of Africa's future and its agency on the global stage. I encourage everyone present to engage actively in today's dialogue. Your perspectives are invaluable and to them of our shared challenges and opportunities as we look forward to empowered and self-sustaining Africa. Once again, thank you for being here. Let us listen, learn, and participate in what promises to be an enlightening and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you.
So welcome to the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies Global African Diaspora Lecture Series. On behalf of the African University of Communications and Business, we are delighted to welcome you to the lecture series, which is a platform dedicated to insightful discussions on the experiences, contributions, and impact of continental Africa and the African diaspora. This series brings together scholars, thought leaders, and change makers to explore the rich tapestry of continental African and African diasporic history, culture, and innovation. We look forward to engaging conversations that inspire new perspectives and meaningful connections. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies is committed to becoming a leading center for Pan-African scholarship and collaboration, bringing together scholars and thinkers from the African world to conduct research and deliberate on issues affecting the welfare and destiny of African peoples, and to disseminate their findings as widely as possible. Additionally, research to create new knowledge that advances professional practice for those at the cutting edge of transformative development. The center contributes significantly to this university's mission of, quote, preparing lifelong learners to become innovative problem solvers and ethical leaders in the fields of communication, business, and related areas through excellence in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and collaboration at the local, regional, and global levels, using a Pan-African framework, unquote, as well as to the university's core value of embracing African cultural values. This university is not merely a university in Africa with an African label. It is an African university with an ethos and the explicit intent to produce graduates who fully understand, appreciate, and unapologetically manifest their Africanness in all spheres of their life. The need to provide an education at the tertiary level that enhances the awareness of students as Africans led to the establishment in 2009 of this center. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies was officially launched under its current name on the 22nd of June of 2015 as an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the creation and advancement of knowledge about people and culture in diaspora through scholarly research, teaching, and publishing at the regeneration and society for joining us today.
We are once again welcome to the Babina Nketia Center for Africana Studies. At this center, we bring to you inspiring lectures. Then today, we are privileged to dive into the topic, Africa's place in the 21st century. China will not save Africa. And our speaker for today's presentation, he holds bachelor's and doctoral degrees in sociology and international relations from Clark University, US, and historical sociology from Binghamton University, US, respectively. As a professor at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, US, he teaches courses that span several disciplines, such as the sociology of human rights, the sociology of civil rights movements, US-Africa relations, the African diaspora, global social problems, African politics through the African novels, introduction to global studies, sociology of globalization, political economy of capitalism, social revolution in Africa, and introduction to sociology. His scholarly interests encompass a wide range of significant epistemic emancipatory areas for Africa, including nationalism, the African states, development and political economy, African diaspora issues, culture and development, the African novel, and increasingly hyper-digital, hyper-computationist, and their implications for Africa. In this context, scholars from Fenun, Mbebe, and Harare inform their teaching and research interests in this field. His current work concerns Sino-Bengalian imperial forays in Africa, which is present as cooperative, bilateral, and multilateral relations. His current book in progress is Surviving Africa in the 21st Century. So, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting much time, shall you join me in welcoming our speaker for today's lecture series, Professor Yidana Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the welcome. I'll do my best to lay out the broad strokes of what this talk is about. I don't consider it a lecture. I consider it a talk. It's a conversation. And at some, once I'm done, I will be very much open to answer questions, perhaps to fill in parts that I may not have fleshed out adequately to the satisfaction of all of us who are present. My interests in China and India, China and India in particular, began sometime around 2009. And the reasoning behind that was because I had some colleagues in political science here, specifically Jacques Mangala, and a few others who expressed some interest on the subject matter. So when I began to think about my current work that is in place, China featured prominently in one of the chapters. But what do I mean by Africa's place in the world? I mean, the title is a bit large in the scope. The scope of the title is a bit broad. But what I simply mean is that Africa stands at we are at the cusp of either pursuing an emancipatory project. And what I mean by an emancipatory project, I mean a way in which Africa is able to become economically and politically sovereign. And what I mean by economically and politically sovereign, I am borrowing from people like Kwame Nkrumah, who talked about it profusely, who made a distinction between political nationalism, which is, banding together to chase away the colonizer, and political sovereignty, which is the capacity, the inherent capacity to build durable institutions with an institutional memory that can lay the foundation for the overall emancipation of the African continent. He also made a distinction between economic nationalism, which is, registering our grievances that we don't like the way outsiders and foreigners are expropriating our resources, to economic sovereignty, that is having the capacity to take charge of our own resources and use the resources wisely for the continent itself. So that's what I mean. The PowerPoint slide is just something, a visual thing for you to follow. And then I would talk from a different piece that I've prepared. And what I mean by China will not save Africa, I want to explain the title before I dive in. I do not mean that there are no positive or creative ways in which multilateral and bilateral relationships between Africa and China can take shape. That's not what I mean. Nor do I mean that the infrastructure model, the economic model, and the cultural model that China is pursuing in Africa is somehow irrelevant or somehow does not have incidental positive outcomes. Of course, there are positive outcomes that we can point to. But what I mean by that is that we need to be careful what we are buying. By buying, I don't mean commodities that we are purchasing from Africa, but because the Chinese model is masking an underlying imperial architecture. And what I mean by an underlying imperial architecture, I mean that China would get to a point in its relationship with Africa where it would have invested enough capital, financial capital, cultural capital, even social capital, that it would have no choice but to begin to meddle in the political affairs and the political sovereignty of African countries in which it is invested heavily. I think currently China's investment in Africa, if I'm correct, is upwards of about 200 billion since 2000. That's the numbers that I have from think tanks that deal with China and Africa. It could be lower. Now, I'm not sure, but we can deal with that at some point. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's a moment of strategic saturation. I call it strategic saturation in my book. And what I mean is the moment in which China has invested enough in which it will have no choice but to meddle in the affairs, in the internal affairs of African countries and in the internal sovereignty of African countries. For that reason, China is no less imperial than the French or the British or the US or the Russians during the Cold War. So that's what I mean here. And without further ado, let me move to look at where Africa is located. There is no question that Africa has the potential to move collectively and structurally in this day and age. The resources are there. The intellectual capacity is there. By intellectual capacity, I'm not talking of the formal or traditional intellectual capacity. I mean that because of digitization and because of hyper-digitization, hyper-automation, and hyper-computation, ordinary Africans are able to participate in the process of nation building, either through business or through other avenues TikTok, Instagram, and all these other places, Facebook, and all these other places. So social sort of discourses, social conversations are diffused in such a way that there's no longer this up-down sort of model, right? So we are poised to do something great. But the question is, what are we lacking? Why is it not happening? I'll get to that. So there are different ways to look at Africa's place in the world. And we can look at it through modeling, the models, the old Western model. And that increasingly is becoming dead, right? The Western model that said that democracy and capitalism is the cure, the end-all, be-all cure for African ills. It is under that model that Africans were advised to adopt the modern way of doing things. And by modern, I mean something specific, the liberal state and liberal economies. And most of us thought that this was God-sent. Everybody thought this was God-sent. By 2000s, our institutions were even told to revise the ways in which they did business. Some called it structural adjustment programs. Others called it neoliberalism. But neoliberalism is essentially a metaphor for expunging the human content out of the rational behavior of institutions, governments and economic institutions, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Now we have the hegemonic Sino-Bengalian model. By Sino-Bengalian model, I mean the Chinese and the Indians. As we speak, India and countries like Kenya have already signed military pacts for security and defense. The Chinese are in Angola, they are in Ghana, they are in Nigeria, they are virtually everywhere in Africa. And that model, of course, is now called BRICS Plus, because there are 5 other nations that have joined, I think Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, and a few others, right? But I see a better potential in the third model, which is the hybrid model, where Africans can find fundamental knowledge systems, right? That is native in nature. By native, I mean continental in nature, but they don't necessarily have to reject Eastern ideas or Western ideas, but they can adopt and adapt to African realities, our political realities, economic realities, social realities, cultural realities, moral as well as ethical realities. So that's what I mean, right? And I want to then move on to the fourth model, the new model that the countries like the US and the European Union are trying to reintroduce into Africa. And this model is not really neoliberal. It's a Johnny come lately in the sense that it's a hegemonic reaction to the sort of China's establishment of influence on the continent. But I want to say something about that before we move on to the next model. And at the outset, I think it's essential to emphasize that the Chinese presence and approach in Africa are not uniform across the continent. They are not, what they are doing in Ghana is not the same as what they are doing in Angola in particular, with Sonangol, the sort of chief extractive institution that was put in place by Dos Santos before the current president, okay? They share 2 common elements: financial, investment, and political characteristics. That is the Chinese state model. If you realize, most African leaders, even in countries that claim to have a democratic system, they have this love affair with the strong, what political scientists call the strong man centralized state model, right? So examples like Uganda, Museveni in Uganda, you have Kagame in Rwanda, and one could say that Traoré in Burkina Faso is within this ilk as well. But under different, they are doing different things. They are doing different things, right? The Chinese state, because of its immense size and its financial strength and geopolitical influence, it is positioned in the 21st century as a global powerhouse. So it is not a situation where Africa can say, we don't want to have any dealings with the Chinese, or we don't want to have any dealings with the Americans, or we don't want to have any dealings with the Brazilians, or the Argentinians, or the Indians, or the Pakistani, or any other sort of outside actors, whether they are private, that is multinational and transnational corporations, or they are intergovernmental financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. We cannot make a decision to the link, but we can make a decision to rectify the extreme imbalances in the relational dynamic in terms of wealth extraction, what dependency theories in the 1960s called unequal exchange. That is to say, the wealth in knowledge, the wealth in resources that leaves the developing world, Africa in particular, to the developed world, far exceeds what is coming back. Let me just give you an example. When the Nigerians kicked out the French and took over the mining of uranium, I think, right? They were making about $10 billion a year under the French. When they kicked the French out and took over, Niger stands to make $200 billion from that same mining industry. So what that means, that's what the unequal exchange means. And modernizing institutions does not necessarily mean that we have to adopt the Western way of doing things. The reason I'm going to talk more about China is that the Chinese have not rejected capitalism. They've simply adopted certain attributes of capitalism and adapted those attributes to their national realities. And as we speak at the moment, the Chinese, some might argue, has already outpaced economically the United States in the world, right? But when I say that China will not save Africa, let me further explain what I mean. The Chinese model is both sinister and patient in how it carves out the world, wresting large swaths of the world away from old imperial states and powers like Russia, the US, Great Britain, and France. Its playbook and manual are globally ubiquitous, meaning you can see it. To Africa, its economic and cultural push appears benign and nonviolent in creating new age wealth. There's a book by Tom Burgess. It's called The Looting Machine. If you're interested, it's one of the best non-academic books that was written with the data and the metrics and the statistics to demonstrate why China is quietly an imperial force on Africa. It is for those reasons, one of those reasons, I do not think that China can save Africa. China introduces a new approach to guiding African nations towards social change and economic development without imposing moral and ethical guilt, or a debt trap, or a complex oversight similar to what the Western world has historically done, particularly more specifically during the structural adjustment period after the debt crisis of the late 1970s and 1980s, after, of course, the oil embargo on the West. The consensus is African government just borrowed foolishly, right? Now, structural adjustment lending was one example of that. When the Chinese began to make their presence felt on the continent, there's a reason why they were embraced, and there's a political intellectual consensus among African leaders why they are gravitating towards China, and there's even a huge element in Africa who see China as a liberator. That to me is dangerous because China is not a liberator. China is investing in China is what I will call a global rentier state. It is renting infrastructure to us. It is renting land, is buying land. We do not know yet how this playbook is going to play out. Nobody knows in 50, 100 years how Sino-African relations is going to look. These economic demands were similar to the neoliberal liberalization and currency devaluation requirements in the 1990s that came to an end somewhere around the 2000s. Okay, but the shift towards China and the growing disdain towards China for the West from Africa is not entirely new. It was fueled by a mix of economic and political pressures from the West, alongside residual bitterness of colonialism, which had officially ended less than 50 years prior. The characteristics of the Chinese state and its power structure is autocratic, is authoritarian, and is dismissive of popular sovereignty, right? That's also something that the immediate anti-colonial leaders like Nkrumah discovered, that you cannot speak a language of popular sovereignty, and then when people rise up, you start to clamp down people. I mean, it's a long story. Yeah, I'll get to that at some point, maybe during question and answering. Yeah. Okay. And the clearest demonstration of the Chinese state's dismissiveness towards popular sovereignty was how it handled the student democratic strikes in the Tiananmen Square in the 1980s. It went in with the military and essentially swept and mowed them down, right? But that's appealing to African leaders. It's appealing to African leaders. These leaders have harbored a quiet disdain historically for transcolonial liberalism, the idea that the West can guide us through certain models. There have been 4 phases. Phase 1, 1960s to about the 1970s. Phase 2, 1970s to about the 1980s. Phase 3, about 1990s to 2000. And then phase 4 is this tussle between the West and India. I mean, China in Africa, with India with its geotechnical sort of imperial push through Mahindra, Tata, is an agribusiness. And that's a conversation we can handle later. So what is the core virtue that we need in Africa? We need good leaders. I call them polylectuals. Polylectuals is a concept I invented, which means political intellectuals. These are technocrats. They are good leaders like Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, who was killed in the 70s at the age of 51. Amilcar Cabral was a brilliant nationalist leader, perhaps philosophically more brilliant than Kwame Nkrumah, if you read his speeches. Yeah, Cabral is the first African leader to argue that if we create a standing and enduring political class, we're going to be in trouble. So he even advocated that after the revolution, after the nationalist revolution, African leaders, those who led the revolution, needed, the metaphor he used was, needed to commit self-suicide. Meaning, if you were an engineer, if you were a business person, if you were a farmer, whatever you were before you joined the nationalist movement, after formal independence, you needed to go back to what you were doing. So they will create a new class to run African countries, a class who would not think that is their birthright, like the way we have in Ghana now, the way we have in Nigeria, and many other African countries where the political and economic elite think that they were born to mess things up for everyone. But anyway, I digress too far. So while not without its faults, this model captivates African states, the Chinese model, despite retaining some imperial traits. Additionally, China provides financial resources, technical infrastructure, high-value projects, and military assistance. The basic military assistance they provide is spy equipment. So Uganda, for instance, now has used Chinese digital technology to monitor its citizens. Nigeria and Angola are on the list. This Chinese model can be reduced to 3 parts: economic, political, cultural, All three make up the blueprint for the Chinese global imperial push. However, China leads with cultural and cooperative economic mutual interest concerning Africa. Let me put the talk down and explain this very carefully. Since at least the 12th century, the world has gone through what Arrighi Giovanni and Immanuel Wallerstein called hegemonic transitions. What that means is there's always a certain number of years, 250 to 200 to 150. We don't know how long American hegemony is going to last, right? From the Italian city-states, Genoa, Florence, and Venice, yeah? There's always been a country at the top that organizes the global economy and the global political system. And that country at the top not only organizes the economic processes, it also creates the military infrastructure to monitor peace or discipline unruly elements within it. So you had that, the Italian city-states, from them to Holland, from Holland to Great Britain, from Great Britain to the US. All of these hegemonies have ruled the world, not just economically, but they've also policed the world morally. By morally, I mean they've tried to dictate the character, form, and nature of states and their governments. They've tried to do things. So the British imperialism tried to monitor the world. There's a reason why the British fought a lot of wars in Malaysia, in Kenya, and all these other places. The US, after 1945, emerged as the clear hegemonic leader, right? Many historians saw the Second World War as the struggle between Germany and the United States to see who succeeded the international system. The problem is the Chinese have studied all these hegemonic transitions. They've come to one fundamental conclusion. As they rise and attempt to supplant the United States as the imperial force, they have chosen deliberately, intentionally, calculatingly, carefully, not to police the world morally. And the economic rationality of that is a powerful force within Chinese imperial thought. I believe 100% that the Chinese are an imperial force in Africa, and I'll define that pretty soon. So Chinese relations with Africa since 1999 to the present, they have chosen not to speak about human rights in their foreign policy towards Africa. That's what I mean by they've chosen not to invest military energy in any country. They're not policing any country because they figured out that ultimately it is the overextension of previous hegemonies that led to their collapse. Yeah, that led to their collapse. So the key question is, can Africa replicate the success of the Chinese economy? Is it possible for Africa to combine a centralized strongman model with wealth creation? Because that's what the Chinese have done. They've been able to combine these two and spur economic development and technical development. Huawei is an example. We talk of TikTok. But not only that, infrastructurally, the Chinese far surpasses any Western nation as we speak now. They're marvels, yeah? Marvels. Does the Chinese model provide successful counter examples for Africans against the failed and exhausted liberal and neoliberal states? In other words, can Africa graft the Chinese model? The reason I'm spending a lot of time on this, and I'll answer more questions later, is because to understand how far Africa is going to go in the middle of the 21st century and beyond, Africa has to deal fundamentally with three things. One is climate change. Yeah, very important. Two is how it deals with what I call the new barbarians. New people coming in, pretending to be our friends, but they are as much leeches as previous ones. And the third is, actually four. The third is good leadership. They are the ones I call polylectuals. These are men and women. These are bureaucrats. They can run governments. They can govern. They are not politicians. Or if they are politicians, once they get to the top of the state, they govern. They produce results. At the same time, they are leaders who can interrogate the dominant ideas that are ruling the world. So ideas rule the world, not actions. Ideas rule the world. After the Second World War, the battle over ideas, economic ideas, was between Maynard Keynes and Friedrich von Hayek from the Austrian Economic School. Maynard Keynes' ideas ran the world up until the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan became presidents of Great Britain and the US respectively. And then they launched their assault on Keynesian economic models. And that model was responsible for phase 1 and 2 of African development coming out of colonialism. It was the model about the developmental state, that is a state that was invested in infrastructure, invested in education, invested in agriculture, invested in water, invested in good roads, invested, that's what, so before then we had a lot of states in Ghana, Nigeria, and many parts until the debt crisis. So to what extent can the centralized strongman wealth-creating Chinese model serve as a viable social system for transcolonial Africa? Let me explain to you what I mean by transcolonial. Many authors speak of Africa in terms of either post-colonial, and for me, I don't think we have moved far enough to have been post anything. We're in a transition. We're still transitional because we haven't succeeded in launching an emancipatory project capable of restoring political and economic sovereignty to African states. Now, most of you students should know by now that any time there's economic problem in Ghana, they run to the World Bank, they run to the IMF. That tells you that we're still not economically, intellectually, and institutionally independent. There's a reason why Tarari in Burkina Faso, the leaders of the Niger, the leaders of the Malian junta, there's a reason why the French have launched a clandestine process to undo both processes. So, the imperial permission, foreign policy structure, and the way the Chinese make their calculations with African relations is one, is geohistorical. What do I mean? China historically is not viewed by Africans generally as colonialists. In fact, during the time of Chairman Mao, some backdoor roles were played in some colonial agitations in Africa. Two, geopolitical power configuration. It has one eye on its economic interests and the other on outsmarting and outbidding all imperial superstates like the US in Africa and the EU. To the extent that geopolitical imperial flashes influence Indian incursions in Africa, supported by Tata, Mahindra, and geo-agricultural imperialism. What I mean by that is, India is investing a lot in those kinds of stuff. So now let me explain a series of things, because I think that there will come a point where Africans will have buyer's remorse. Now, when I talk of good leadership and insightful polylectual leadership, I just explained to you who they are. There's a problem generally in Africa. And that problem is that we have not created nativist statecrafts. By nativist, I mean continentally derived statecrafts that have established long-standing and enduring institutional memory of governing. Some will say, well, Kagame has done that in Rwanda. I will reply and say, we don't know yet whether it is the sheer charismatic power of Kagame that is running Rwanda, or if Rwanda has enduring and good institutions. The only time we can answer that question is when Kagame has come and gone. If at the moment it's the institutions in Rwanda that are running the show, then it won't matter whether it's Kagame or somebody else who comes. So Kagame goes and somebody comes in the future. They will continue to be competent. They will continue to be efficient. They will continue to function. But if it is the charismatic authority of Kagame that is making these countries, making Rwanda achieve the results that it's achieving, then once Kagame goes, the possibility that Rwanda can fall back into chaos is there. So that's what I mean. All right. So what would Africa do given what I've laid out? Now, with China, China is my primary focus here. With China, there are some things to look at. Africa must have a clearer understanding of the emerging ideas that run the world. That's why we need leaders like that. This concept, polylectures, to me, there have been very few leaders like that in Africa. Sankara is one, Tarare is one, Patrice Lumumba, former Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. I will add Steve Biko. If you're interested, read. He has a book called I Write What I Like. There's a chapter called The Righteousness of Our Cause. One of the best critics of the underlying liberal nonsense. Yeah, that's the way he saw that. Okay, and Cabral from Guinea was another. Those are the type that I call polylectuals. Even Kagame qualifies as a polylectual because he has a clear understanding of Western liberalism. He also has a clear understanding of Sino-African relations. So he's not deluded into thinking that China will save Africa. So the new breed of leaders that I call polylectuals, we need a critical mass of those so that there is a glacial move of the continent towards itself, so that our negotiating leverage on the global stage, and by that I mean the United Nations, as we speak, Africa has no voice on the Security Council, and that is the part of the United Nations that makes most of the decisions. We have membership in the WTO, true, but we were battered and bruised before we got that membership. I have never seen an African run the World Bank, and I've never seen an African run the International Monetary Fund. But these are all consequential foot soldiers. They are consequential institutions. So it's not a question of whether Africa should be part of the new global order. I'm not advocating for Africa to delink. Every culture borrows. Every society borrows. Social order borrows. There's no historical social order that can claim that it has not borrowed from any other cultures. But here's why. Experiences are essential in all areas of human affairs and development. Imperial and colonial legacies facilitate understanding of similarly evolving and situated processes and policies today, as we see with China. In the 18th and 19th centuries, African systems and their leaders, Al-Kanami, Osman Danfodio, Perempe in Ghana, Shaka Zulu in South Africa, Queen Nzinga, the list goes on and on and on and on. We have to judge them differently and less harshly because they learned to adapt to the surprises and cruelties of the colonial system as it evolved. But the same cannot be said for the social and political systems of the middle to late 20th century and the 21st century. Why? Because they are expected to exhibit more mature and intelligent skepticism, not rejection, skepticism towards all new relations that display tendencies similar to past or old formal imperial colonial ventures. I have in mind new geopolitical and geoeconomic actors like China, when I say that, or India to a lesser extent, who disguise their strategic intent for Africa's resources as cooperative cultural and economic globalization. Are they building roads? Yes. Railways? Yes. Are they giving loans? Yes. Are they building airports? Yes. To become clear, the argument I'm making, an undivided, resolute, and complex approach at both the political and intellectual levels will bring attention to the long-term burdens that China and India potentially can impose on Africa in terms of being hegemonic, rentier global superstates, that is, rent-seeking global superstates or empires, if we wish. All of that as things we need to consider. The institutional and historical memory of the crisis of the 1980s. I'm talking of most of you or all of you may not have been born. I was a little child then. I'll be 59 in May. In the 80s, when Nigeria repatriated Ghanaians back, even kenke, we used to queue to buy raw kenke to cook. Roasted granules and plantain, we used to queue. Ask your fathers, they will tell you. That memory is seared in the national conscience. You know, Rawlins tried to take us out of there, but eventually he also capitulated to the world order, the liberal world order. But that capitulation usually is a consequence of the sweetness of power. Power becomes sweet, and they want to remain in power more so than change the country significantly. Additionally, the neoliberal system that have held Africa hostage since the 1980s through policies enacted by global financial and trade institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, they emerge as Western reactions to irresponsible borrowing, they said. But it was in fact the reason structural adjustment was imposed on Africans. The debt crisis was real, but that's not the reason. They wanted to dismantle the developmental state that was put in place from the 1960s. As the West and its foot soldiers have continued, these things are things that Africans need to be thinking about. But consider the two dominant members of the Asiatic bloc, that's China and India, who are also part of the geo-economic and geopolitical constitution of the acronym BRICS Plus. About what has just been said in the preceding paragraph, there must be a heightened sensitivity among African political leaders and their intellectual circle, which informs their governing ideologies. I mention this to emphasize that there's ample historical evidence suggesting that Sino-Bengalian African economic and cultural relations will inevitably reach a point of strategic relational saturation, prompting the Asiatic bloc. They are not just building infrastructure, they are also lending money. So let's not think that our indebtedness is just to the West. We are also incurring debt to the East. And that has implications and consequences. What if they make enough investment in the continent? Who is to say if they will take a practically and historically less traveled road, a clandestine one, and how will they ensure that Africa is held accountable if we default on our loans? Now, for those of you who may know, a few years ago, China tried to seize the airport in Entebbe, Uganda. And the reason, they had not paid on the $200 million loan that was used to build that airport. It was Ugandan parliamentarians who discovered that, made noise about it, and the Chinese say, oh no, we're not doing that, and the list goes on and on and on. $200 million. But here is the issue. China's response to that case involves bilateral and multilateral diplomatic doublespeak, because the Chinese were saying the Americans are trying to, drive a wedge between us and Africans. No, we are not taking back the loan, and the list went on and on and on. So what, for instance, is the saturation point at which losses of its investments in Africa might become too significant for China's global hegemonic project and its push to replace the US? We need to think about that. That's what I mean by China will not save us. Only Africans can save themselves. Will such a strategic threshold compel China to protect its interests by taking drastic measures that may sacrifice Africa in pursuit of its broader global geopolitical goals, hegemonic goals? In other words, Asia, Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean combined might become too important that China might take some drastic measures to address that. So what must such a drastic debt collection or retrieval measure look like? These questions may sound like projections. However, they are not. The Ugandan example could indicate a Sino-African crisis in the horizon. Most of you are in Ghana. You see the Chinese in Ghana. I am not ethnocentric. They are buying land in northern Ghana. In fact, recently, in where I'm from in Walwale, they wanted to build a donkey meat factory there. And eventually, the people stood up and they moved away. But they're everywhere. They are mining in Upper East as I speak. They are mining in some parts of between Nankanduri, Nalergu, Nankanduri, going towards Bunkutu side. They are fundamentally the backbone of Galamsey climate destruction in Ghana. The most consequential signal crisis of the 21st century is climate. They are partly responsible for that. So, because of this, Africa's unexamined relations with China concerns me, and it may become more costly than formal Euro-Western imperial colonialism. Like other areas such as the ecosystem survival, Africa needs resolute political and conscientious attention to whether its relationship with China harbors unspoken yet palpable political, economic, cultural, and digital dangers in the horizon. Because nothing ever comes purely good. To pursue relations within the world system, Africa, in its diversity, Africa needs unique systemic arrangements, policies, views, shared knowledge, cultures, practices that are attuned to new versions of old historical systems, new barbarians. They are imperial, but they say we're just your friend. They are imperial, but they say just economic relations. In the doctrine of sovereign inequality in international relations, no nation, China is not going to invest trillions of dollars, assuming, in Africa. Say 1 trillion, let's assume that. And not expect 2 or 3 or 4-fold that back. As we speak, the textile industry in West Africa is dead. The Chinese global economy is responsible. Most of these things are now being manufactured in China and then brought back to West Africa. The issue is not whether Africa should aim to have or seek or pursue strategic relations with any country. That's not the point. Like it or not, the world is rapidly changing, and China would become the hegemonic power in a few more years. So I'm not suggesting that we should delink. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have any economic, technical, cultural, or political relations with China. I'm not saying that. But when I describe China as imperialistic, I do so in a specific way. The strange, lopsided, and highly unequal relations between Africa and these two countries, that China and India, right? So let me just run through this, right? So I've talked about the neoliberalism. I've talked about the Sino-globalism. That's what I just went through. China's tentacles, spread of China's tentacles around the world. So clearly, if Africa is going to move massively in a direction that recoups and in an emancipatory economic and political as well as cultural direction, the tools are there. What we lack are good institutions, good leaders, and enlightened citizenry. brave, bold, enlightened. Yeah, that's what I mean by that. So I've talked about BRICS, but I've also pointed out the caution that is needed because of the inherent principle of international relations, right? Every country makes decisions to benefit more from it, and not equally with partners or vice versa. And Africa must get to that point. This is why Nkrumah was way ahead of his time. I know that some Ghanaian political leaders have tried to muddy his name and say that J.B. Danquah was more consequential than Nkrumah. That's just nonsense. J.B. Danquah had no respect for ordinary people to begin with. If you can read Richard Wright's book, okay? Now, so the concept polylecturals, what I just went over, right? They are critical. We need them, a lot of them in Africa. If we can have maybe 30 of them running the African continent, that sort of shift, seismic economic and political shift that I'm talking about is possible, particularly in the age of hyper-globalization, in the age of digital globalization, in the age of financial globalization, in the age of cultural globalization. Yeah, we need these kinds of leaders. They are very important, and we need good institutions. That's what I mean by the polylectures, is the definition here. Kutam, if you need the PowerPoint when I'm done, or the speech itself, I can send it to you. Yeah? Courageous leadership. Yeah. So for me, to be honest, the ultimate tool that Africa as a whole, and I'm speaking Africa as a whole collectively, because when Nkrumah was talking about continental Africa, the argument he was making in most of his speeches, there's a 3-volume speeches that was compiled, was that any single African country that does well in a chronically under-leveraged Africa, in a chronically powerless Africa, in a chronically cheated Africa, that country would inevitably become chronically powerless and chronically economically challenged, chronically politically unstable. But if they cede some sovereignty for continental sort of collective, not just a collective drive, but a collective rethinking and narrative about what it means to be an African and what is Africa's place within the world system and the world order. Nkrumah's point was, ultimately, even the weaker ones will become strong and stronger if there's a collective economic strength. Collective continental political sovereignty would inevitably lead to collective continental economic sovereignty. Ultimately, they got rid of him for that. Another thing we need, this is the final statement, are public intellectuals. What I mean is, it's not that there are no intellectuals in the universities, but what they write. How many people actually read what they write? The critical masses who need to understand the reason Sankara and Tarari have been successful in Burkina Faso is they've been able to translate complex ideas into the language of the commons, what I call the language of the commons in my book. We intellectuals speak a language that an ordinary taxi driver on the street, or yellow driver in Tamale, or whatever they call them, or keke driver in Nigeria, does not have time to decode such language. We need public intellectuals, meaning a conscientious number of intellectuals like myself. My book is taking long because I want the language to move away from the intellectual sort of grammar and acquire ordinariness, so that even a secondary school kid who picks that book to read will understand the fundamental crises Africa faces in the 21st century moving forward. They are all signal in nature. By signal, I mean they are still reversible. Even climate issues in Africa are still reversible with bold leadership, good institutions, and the like, and the like, and the like. But they have a potential of becoming terminal. And if those, so like poverty, hunger, climate change, joblessness, health, yeah, if they continue to be unattended, they are going to reach the point of what I call a terminal, becoming terminal crisis, meaning they will reach a point where they will become irreversible. So Africa must wake up, as Nkrumah said then, and understand that no single country is capable of emancipating itself outside of the continental context. Nkrumah's point was the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Okay, Professor Yidana, we greatly appreciate your insightful discussion or lecture. And we look forward to having a productive discussion about it. I'll first open up the floor. To our guest in-house as well as online. If there's anyone online who'd like to ask a question or engage, please just kindly raise your hand and we will recognize you. But we also have guests in-house at AUCB, some very new students who are working here at the university. So I'm sure they have some comments or questions as well. Would anybody like to start or ask a question first? Yes. Okay, so we have one student.
I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop the sharing, okay?
Okay, thank you.
So I can see them.
Well, my question is about BRICS.
Yeah.
Since you emphasize a lot about it.
Can you speak? I can't hear you well, so I need to hear it well to give you a good, yeah.
It's about BRICS.
Yes.
But my problem here is the fact of Putin being there.
Yeah.
It's very troubling. And the second is the Saharan, this new Saharan policy, whereby Niger has just, how do I call it? Is there an elected president? What is it? Which way are they politicalizing? Because this Saharan came out of Russians' rebellion to whereby they're collaborating with them. Here it breaks with Russia, and it's a bit conflicting.
Okay. So you want me to address that?
Yes, of course.
Okay. You know, you're correct in the general contours of your observation is correct. My response to that is the same thing that I raised earlier. You know, the mix of, they say the makeup of BRICS is a legitimate thing to say, well, you have all these, men like Putin and all these people on it. And of course, the Sahelian stuff. For me, I think that it's still too early for us to, at least for me, I talk about BRICS a lot in one of my chapters, but it's too early to tell what BRICS will become. And this is what I mean. There's a German historian called Ludwig Deo. He wrote a book called The Precarious Balance. And he makes an argument that, look, there are a lot of movements, there are institutions and organizations that come into being, and they come, and their rhetoric is very democratic in nature, but they end up having very authoritarian and autocratic sort of actions and tendencies. And BRICS, right now, if you look at the makeup, one could say, well, you have the centralized state of Russia, centralized state of China. And obviously, if you look at the makeup, I think United Arab Emirates just joined. That's why it's now BRIC Plus and a few other countries. I think that Africans should approach BRICS with caution, but not with rejection. That's my position on it.
Another follow-up. I know South Africa, it's already there.
Yes,
I know
South Africa was
Africa,
originally part.
the
Yes.
makeup of it.
Yeah.
Could it be South Africa being the bone of, how do I put it, African representative there, or what exactly should this come up with when it comes to African involvement to that?
African involvement with BRICS.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think Ethiopia is also now a member.
Yes, this is joined.
Yeah, they just joined. That's why it's called BRIC Plus. You know, it is at its infancy. So, frankly, any intellectual worth their salt who study institutions and organizations like myself is one of the most perplexing organizations because it is still at its infancy. Most things they are saying now, the fundamental geopolitical reason they wanted to create a bloc to counterweight the Western world, create a currency to counterweight the dollar. It's still too early. Now, if they will open up to more African representation, why not? Yeah, I mean, we should join because of the argument I made earlier that the world is increasingly becoming interconnected. Not that increasingly, it's already interconnected. And Africa would need to source intellectual capital as well as give intellectual capital. So bilateralism is not a bad idea. Organizational multilateralism is not a bad idea. The question is whether BRICS will begin to behave Sino-Russian as opposed to a global organization, just like how the IMF has been monopolized. So if your worry is the monopolization of the organizations, thereby rendering Africans sterile, their presence and representation, they're sterile, that could happen. But then it goes back to my argument that if we have good leaders leading the countries, that sterility will not happen because they will make good arguments and they will push for a representation that takes into account the historical lessons of the disarticulation of Africans from many other important global organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, of course. The WTO is different now, but it is still Western dominated. So that's just my view on it.
Yeah. Well taken, and let's see how they progress about that.
Exactly, but the only if we continue to have blind men leading us, they will not see if there are problems within it.
Okay, sir, please help. My question is, you talked about polylecturals.
Yes.
So please, I want to know, are polylecturals trained? Do somebody need to be trained before he or she can become a polylectural, or it is just gained naturally? And if so, why is it that over the years, we don't like even have one polylectural in Africa?
No, we've had them. I've mentioned a few. I'm a historical sociologist as well as a political economist. So I'll never make a naturalist argument about leadership. Yeah, of course, Karl Marx said that men make their own history, but not under circumstances chosen. Right. So polylecturals are principled men and women who, when given the challenges of the moment, rise to the fore and lead in the future to be able to lead in the present. That's what Torari is doing. So we've had examples. There's a reason that those are always considered a threat to the global order. Nkrumah, to me, so polylecturalism as a concept is an ideal type, but their real social presence is mediated by other things. So I mentioned Amilcar Cabral, who was murdered. I mentioned Steve Biko, who was also murdered. These are men and women who can speak the language that moves people to understand the importance of civic responsibility, national responsibility. You know, when people in Ghana, I hear people say, "Abindia," that level of sort of quagmire, mental quagmire. So polylectuals, they are partly born, but they are partly made, because you have to be human to be a polylectual, yeah? But these are men who govern. They are not selfish. Power is not why they are in power. They are empowered to transform the social ecosystem, the economic ecosystem. That's what so to answer your question directly, they are partly made. Now, why we don't have them is the selfishness of the collective mindset of many African countries. So let me give you an example. If you have ever heard of Ken Soro-Wiwa? Ken Soro-Wiwa led an environmental movement against, I think, Shell in Nigeria. I think it was during Abacha's government. And then they hanged him. From that day till now, Ken Soro-Wiwa's wife and children are struggling. And nobody cares that this is somebody who sacrificed his life to protect the quality of lives of a majority of people. So it's that kind of selfishness. They are there. They are in Ghana, they are in Nigeria, they are everywhere. But they look at the mindset, the greed, the corruption of the masses, and they say, I'm not going to sacrifice my life for these kinds of people. But imagine a scenario where men and women are speaking truth to power, are developing skill set where the might of right rules over the right of might. And they may be imprisoned, they may be killed, but if the society is banding together to take care of their families, take care of their wives, take care of whatever, and continue the vision, polylecturalism would eventually begin to train more polylecturals. Yeah, Ayukwama has spoken about this in Osiris Rising very clearly in the last chapter. So I think that they are creatures of circumstances. By that I mean history, politics, and the like, and the like, alike. The reason we don't have them is the collective selfishness of our own societies.
Okay, thank you, sir. So how do you think this kind of selfishness can be break? How can we break this selfishness?
The way to break it is to demonstrate concern for national wealth, national power, and to demonstrate and to band together how many people who have been locked in Nigeria recently. This Nigerian public intellectual, I've forgotten his name. One lawyer prevailed upon the government in Nigeria to lock him up under the pretext that he had defamed him or sullied his name. And eventually, it's Nigerians who came on the street and they demonstrated. They were not even going to give him the bond. It's the demonstration that caught the attention of the government. How many people have been locked in Ghana simply because they've said something that a leader doesn't like? And once they are locked, how many of you actually band together to call the government to task? They are there. But the only way they are going to show themselves is if we start demonstrating that we have a collective destiny to protect, we have a collective future to protect, and that our posterity, our children, deserve better, that we inherited something, and we have no right, as Nyerere said, to bequeath to our children anything less than what we inherited. They are there. They are in your secondary schools. They are principled young boys. They are principled young men. They are principled young girls. They are principled young women. They are there. But they look at the collective attitude political attitude, social attitude. And there's no benefit in sacrificing your freedom or sacrificing your life for a society that doesn't even care for the purpose for which you are sacrificing it. We are just selfish and greedy. Everybody grabs. We are corrupt, we pillage, we plunder. Why do you think people take bank loans to run for parliament in Ghana? So, or Nigeria, or any other country. Taurari is a poly-lecturer. Look at what he's doing in Burkina Faso. Granted, some might say, well, but he came in through the gun. Well, those who came in through the ballot box, they just left. They will leave again. Do they leave Ghana better than they came? Taurari came in through the gun, but he's going to leave Burkina Faso better, even if they succeed in assassinating him, because there have been about 12 or 13 assassination attempts on him. Why? Why do you think the assassination attempt tend to go to the men and women historically? Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney in Guyana, historically within the black global sphere, the people that are assassinated, or even Frantz Fanon, the guy who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, they assassinate men and women who drive people to act, who change the way people think, who change mindsets. In 2022, I gave a talk at the African Center for Economic Transformation. And it was about this. How do we change the mindset? Yeah, you have to shift the mindset. Yeah, so let me give you an example. I gave this example at that talk as well. If you take three children from Prosec, 3 children from Ghana International, 3 children from Navrongo Secondary School, 3 from Tamale Secondary School, anywhere, Accra girls, Kumasi girls, put them in the same room and ask them the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? They'll give you an assortment of occupational aspirations. If you ask them why, I'm going to bet you each of them is going to give you a material response. None will give you a response that has collective national interest at heart. So our institutions, institutions, schools, you start with the family, schools, social institutions, schools, religion, churches, government, economy, the mass media. These are all important social institutions that can play a role. So changing the mindset of a nation is the most important thing. Once you can change the mindset of nations to understand the collective destiny of the nation, that's what Karl Marx said, where the free development of each constitutes the free development of all. The advancement of each constitutes the advancements of all, and the advancements of all constitutes the advancement of each. Then these polylecturals, they will become a norm. At the moment, they are not normative. They are rare. And not only are they rare, they are also an endangered species. That has been the history. But like I said, you should look into Amilcar Cabral. You can ask Professor Kutam after that. Look into Steve Biko. I write what I like, right? Look into the speeches that Cabral gave. There are 3-volume book that is written on Thomas Sankara, and you understand what I mean by polylectural. There are very few. Kagame is one other example. We'll see. Time will tell. But anyway, good question, by the way.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. Let's see if we have any questions online. I haven't noticed any so far. In-house, we are open to additional questions, comments, concerns, anything you'd like to say to Professor Yidana. So wonderful, thank you. Okay, I have a few questions I've written, so some of you may think of some additional questions afterwards. Should I ask my question now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I have a few written down, but I'll start with the first one that I wrote. That question is, find it. Not, I'll just paraphrase it, but I actually wrote it out. What do you think, Professor Yidana, what do you think of the Chinese cultural institutions that are being established in Ghana as well as in other African countries?
You know, I've been reflecting on that a bit. But that is, they are the sort of psychological blueprint of Chinese imperialism. And I do not have any hope. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Yeah. I do not have any hope that those cultural institutions, look, I come to Ghana every year, and more as I observe the presence of Chinese cultural artifacts, whether they are ideas, whether they are material, it concerns me. And that's exactly why I spoke earlier that that's what perplexes me about the current crop of leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Because the blueprint from which to evaluate the honesty and intentions of Chinese incursions into Africa, it's not even 70 years old. If you think of formal Euro-Western imperialism. But if you think of it in terms of the way I think of it, that colonialism never truly ended, it just recalibrated itself in different guises and injected different things. I think of it in terms of the sharecropping in the American South that actually reinvented and created a second slavery. It's the same thing. So it perplexes me that they are not sort of attuned to this fundamentally disruptive cultural vestige of Chinese imperialism. It is disruptive. So it's almost like our leaders are more interested in holding on to power than actually finding cooperative ways to launch an emancipatory project. It has to be a project, Professor Kutam. And the cultural institutions are, pathways into the minds and hearts of Africans to legitimate, right? Remember, colonialism had legitimating ideologies. The Chinese cultural institutions are the beginning of frameworks for legitimating ideologies to legitimate China's sort of attempt to colonize Africa. Now, I'm by no means saying that there might not be some incidental positives in those cultural institutions. That's not what I'm saying. But it's like the argument that people make that colonialism was positive because it left us languages and left us governments. That's nonsense. Colonialism did not introduce governance into Africa. They introduced a European version of governance, European institutions into Africa. As Achebe argues in Things Fall Apart, Ngugi argues that in The Devil on the Cross, and Osman Sembène on The Last of the Empires and Ghost Bits of Wood. So I have a very bleak and negative opinion of it, but I am not sort of oblivious to the fact that there could be some incidental goods that comes out of it. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much for that insightful response. Again, if anyone online has a question, you can certainly indicate to us and we'll recognize you. We are approaching the near end of this program in about, say, 15 minutes or less. I have two additional questions, at least, that I have written, but I also want to give the audience members a chance to speak if they'd like to. Is there anyone who would like to ask Professor Yidana a question? Comment? We'll try to make sure you meet him when he next visits Ghana as well. So maybe you'll think of a question by then. But in the interest of time, I'll ask both questions and you can respond to them in whichever order you choose. The first question, how do we cultivate or create an African consciousness on our campuses at all levels in Ghana and Africa in general? And the second question was sparked by conversations that I've been following as a part of a study group that's global in terms of the African diaspora, but the facilitator is based here in Ghana. I'm wondering, what do you think about the contingency of people who think that or see China as leading the fight or charge against white supremacy?
Is it, there's a book I'm reading now, and there's a chapter on that. Look, I'm taking the second one first, okay? Because the first one is a difficult question to answer. Because Europhilia, maybe let me start from the first one. Europhilia is it's a concept I use to mean European sickness. Europhilia, Anglophilia, English sickness, English disease, Francophilia, Lussophilia, that is Portuguese. They have seeped into, I would say, the DNA thought structure of African institutions. Yeah. For instance, I came to the US in 1991. Many consequential African thinkers, I read them in American universities. Not at Navasco. I did English literature for my A levels. Guess what we read? Chaucer, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Murder in the Cathedral. That's what they're teaching us. When we studied geography, we're studying stalactites and stalagmites. And I'm looking around and I'm saying, we don't have these physical entities in Africa for us to get a practical experience. We have jettisoned the legitimacy of our culture. That's what I'm saying. And part of the reason why it's going to be difficult to cultivate an African consciousness. When I was in secondary school, if you began talking, I would say you're Kolo, 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 Kolo. But the main reason is it's difficult to convince the average Ghanaian that Ghanaian culture is superior to British culture. It's difficult to convince the average Senegalese that Senegalese culture is superior to French culture. Heck, even the head of state is married to a French woman. The current, what's his name? Colonel Domboya. It's Guinea, sorry, it's Guinea. Yeah, Senegal, the head of state is pretty young and good. So I think that one will be difficult to achieve unless the institutions rectify their curricula to allow 60% African-centered material, 20% Western-centered material, and 20% Eastern-centered material. Otherwise, it's difficult because, we become what we read, Professor Kutam. We become what we hear. We become what we see. We're cognitive, visual, intellectual creatures. So that will be difficult. In terms of the contingency who see China, for me, that's an absurd position to take. The Chinese are more racist. Anywhere they've been in Africa, they are more racist to Black Americans here than even white people. So I don't know where that is. That's a historical myth. And that historical myth comes from the relations that were constructed during the civil rights movement and during colonialism. That's why I think that's where it comes from. They are anti-racist because they are anti-American, but they are not culturally anti-racist because they are as so you could pass this argument to say that, okay, fine, politically, by bucking the American system, by bucking the Western liberal hegemonic order through BRICS and other sort of diplomatic movements in other parts of the world, they could be defined as politically anti-racist. But race and culture is not the driver of why China has tentacles around the world. The primary driver is to supplant the United States. That's one. So even if you were to make a political argument, it falls short. Now, the cultural argument to me is just absurd. I mean, most of you are in Ghana. Haven't you seen the China? Professor Kutam, you have not witnessed Chinese racism in Ghana?
For that response, Professor. Yeah.
Yes.
Have you witnessed Chinese racism in Ghana? A few say, some say yes. Most have said no. Would anybody like to elaborate? Okay, we've had some that say their products are all over, so they're asking in which perspective, which would you like to? Okay, so some are agreeing with that statement, arguing that their products have saturated every aspect of our lives. Anyone else? Someone who said they don't agree.
I mean, so imagine if the Chinese start seizing land in Africa because a country has defaulted on its loan. Imagine that.
Yeah, so your point. So that goes into the treaty they signed with the government. Well, what does it entail? Before this magnesium, this bauxite, this thing, what was the treaty that was signed to it? So who have the ownership?
Yes, the question you raise goes to the principle of transparency, right? A responsible government will be transparent about the terms of the treaty.
Well,
so
well.
Pardon?
Very well.
Exactly. So, you know, as we speak, the Chinese are the most dominant extractors of resources in Africa as we speak now. They've even overtaken the French and the Americans. And so, and because there's no transparency, the public good dimension of such treaties is difficult to assess because the public has no idea what the nature and the terms of the treaties are. Yeah.
So we thank you very much. I just want to confirm if there are any questions or comments. We're about a couple of minutes away from closing at 4 p.m. So if you have a burning question or concern you'd like to share, please do so now. If not, I think we'll give a few closing remarks and call it a day. So, as we conclude this session of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies Global African Diaspora Lecture Series, we would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speaker, Professor Yidana, and to participants for their insightful contributions. Let's give Professor Yidana a round of applause. I, for one, am very pleased that such a young group of people have been able to engage one of the most important African intellectuals operating today, particularly in the diaspora, but also always in constant conversation with the continent and the entire world. Today's discussion has deepened our understanding of continental Africa and the African diaspora's impact and significance. I encourage us to carry forward the knowledge and inspiration that we've gained here, fostering continued dialogue and collaboration. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Until we meet again, as the acting director of the Nketia Center, keep the conversation alive.
Thank you.